The Festival of Art History and the Fontainebleau Castle are happy to welcome you at the 9th edition of this festival. We will deal with museum management in the Nordic country with Marlene Hansen and Tone Hansen. Enjoy the conference. Yes.
Me or us. You can see Hansen is not such an unusual name. You have the privilege of hearing two of us. I'm from Denmark, though, and Tone is from Norway.
And we're not in family.
Not at all, but we know each other. We've been working together before. Today I will talk about, as you can see, curating the contemporary in the Art Museum, and I'll mainly speak about the Danish Museum of Modern Art, Louisiana. The paradox of the contemporary. This term addresses the intrinsic problematic situation of museums of modern and contemporary art today. The historical emphasis that has been characteristic of the traditional museum, with its core mission of collecting and conservation, seems sharply at odds with the contemporary. Art historian Beatrice von Bismarck, to name just one, has noted. Thus, many of the museums of contemporary art established after the Second World War were premised on a thorough reconception of the very category of the museum itself. The Louisiana Museum of Modern Art in Denmark was among the new challengers of the traditional museum. In my presentation today, I will share with you some aspects of my current research project at the University of Copenhagen. It's called Curating the Contemporary, an Exhibition History of the Museum of Modern Art as a New Bildung institution. And by Bildung, this German expression, it's meant both education and self-education. Louisiana, I argue, was, especially in its first 2 decades after it was founded in 1958, it was a key model for an art museum that attempted to take on the challenge of curating the contemporary, that is, of forming a museum for contemporary society, a Bildung institution for the Danish welfare society. And yet today, Louisiana conforms in many ways to the standard of international museums of modern art and has been regarded by politicians and the public as an ideal role model for Danish art museums by attracting large numbers of visitors with its series of exhibitions and cultural events. However, when Louisiana opened its doors to the public in 1958, it caused both great attention and intense debate. Louisiana is located just north of Copenhagen in a gorgeous park, old park on the brink of Øresund, facing the coast of Sweden. It was built to welcome broad audiences and create spaces for the public to meet and experience modern art. The public was generally enthusiastic about it and welcomed the new institution. It was soon even called one of the most beautiful museums in the world. Nevertheless, it also spurred intense debate about the role of the art museum in the Danish society. Louisiana was seen as the antipole of conformism and as a provocateur in the Danish museum world. At the time, established art museum curators downgraded Louisiana as vulgar in its popularity and its unpretentiousness a threat to the proper way of experiencing art. One commentator noted about the cafeteria that, how can you contemplate art in such mundane settings? Indeed, when asked about his view on Louisiana, the then director of the National Gallery of Denmark criticized the constantly changing series of exhibitions by stating, "You can hardly call it a museum, rather it is a showcase for exhibitions." And here you see, at the bottom you see the museum the director was head of, the National Gallery of Denmark, back then called Statens Museum for Kunst. The photo is from 1977. And at top you see the entrance to Louisiana. Thus, at Louisiana, the good experience with both alpha and omega. Most importantly, though, the good experience was seen as key to Bildung, by helping forming of creative and competent democratic citizens. That is, to be relevant and important to the public in a new dynamic society. Museums needed to change, the founder of Louisiana, Knud Jensen, claimed. Instead of museums built as temples or fortresses for art, like the traditional and well-known types, such as Denmark's National Gallery. It was built in 1906. Louisiana, the modestly human-scaled architecture and a constant stream of changing temporary exhibitions became key to welcoming the public and creating new and creative democratic public spaces. As such, it underscored the assertion that the exhibition is the primary site of exchange in the political economy of art, since the exhibition is where artworks meet their public, as curators and art historians Greenberg, Ferguson, and Nairn have argued in their seminal book, Thinking About Exhibitions, which formed part of the rising field of new muséology some 20 years ago. Part spectacle, part socio-historical event, part structuring device, the exhibition establishes and administers the cultural meanings of art. And this is particularly relevant for contemporary art, they stated. Louisiana was meant to be an unpretentious space for art exhibitions, to be an open and popular venue. It was also built to make the non-elitist visitor in particular feel welcome. Knud Jensen wanted to create an atmosphere in which you feel as though you're visiting a private home. He said it should be like visiting an eccentric uncle in the countryside. And even as the museum later grew to its present much larger scale, Jensen insisted on an air of hominess by keeping the entrance of the old Villa Louisiana, which the museum developed around. Louisiana was created to entice people, to enjoy, relax, and experience its site. The interplay of the you can see again, yeah. The interplay of the parkland it inhabited and the cozy cafeteria facing Øresund with its small library. Where you could drink a cup of coffee in front of the fireplace and enjoy the beautiful view of Sweden across the water. In its first couple of years, Louisiana focused on showing contemporary art and design and put it on display. But Louisiana also allowed visitors to freely use the furniture. There were flowers and vases and ashtrays were available in addition. And during the first years, there were no guards. all to create a warm and welcoming setting for the best possible experience when meeting with art. Members' clubs were set up. One for adults, one for young people. Everyone could join in and become part of the Louisiana Club. What is more, para-curatorial events were introduced right from the start. Concerts, both classical, chamber music, and jazz. Sometimes they even danced in the rooms with paintings and sculptures on the wall. And as well as debates, as you see here, with the intellectuals and the broader public alike, and often in the first years with very urgent, important issues about the role of art in society, and there was this great belief in the role of art. Also, children were welcomed at Louisiana. First, in a room where they could paint while their parents visited the exhibitions. I remember myself visiting Louisiana maybe at 5 years old or so, sitting and painting. This was my first Museum of Modern Art experience. And later on, Louisiana developed a specific children's house that was built along with highly advanced educational programs, setting new international standards for children's education. Knud Jensen stressed the focus on children as one of the most important roles for the Art Museum, that is, to help form children to become creative and free citizens in the democratic welfare society. Indeed, educational strategies in general were fundamental to Louisiana. Instead of traditional catalogs, the Louisiana Revue, for example, here you see members' clubs, how to sign up, and here you see a couple of the first issues of Louisiana Revue. It was a magazine presenting core themes of the museum's mission in a non-art professional lingo, often combining both articles on art and on society in general. Especially in the first decade, Louisiana Revue took on a very broad cultural perspective and would, for example, bring 10 pages of photojournalism about the Swedish welfare state when they were showing art from Moderna Museet in Stockholm in 1960. It was the Moderna Museet in Stockholm, which opened a few months before Louisiana in 1958, that was part of the inspiration for the strategy of the Danish institution, along with the Stedelijk in Amsterdam and MoMA in New York. At first, Knud Jensen actually wanted to create a collection focusing on Danish modern art and developing the Scandinavian art connections. Remember, this was 10 years after the end of the war, and they wanted to develop this strong Nordic connections. However, after visiting Documenta in Kassel in 1959, Knud Jensen experienced what he called his Documenta shock. Here he was faced with an exhibition of international art that blew him away, not least Jackson Pollock's work, and in 1959 he changed the strategy for Louisiana. It was now to be a museum of modern art that focused on collecting international, that is, mainly Western post-war art. Yet while it takes a considerable time and means to build a collection, exhibitions are more dynamic, and you can quickly change your curatorial strategy, as Jensen did. Immediately after seeing Documenta, he managed to arrange a small exhibition at Louisiana in 1959, Works from Documenta. It was a landmark exhibition in Denmark and on show along with an exhibition of works by the Danish sculptor Robert Jacobsen. Louisiana presented an impressive series of exhibitions, no less than 70 during its first 10 years. In this way, the sheer number of exhibitions held at Louisiana in the 60s was much higher than the traditional museum, and taken as a whole, they represented the sort for a dynamic and varied art scene. To be sure, Louisiana's exhibition program presented a mix of cutting-edge contemporary international art, broader cultural shows like showing cars from Pompeii and art from South America, and architectural and design exhibitions, as well as a number of exhibitions presenting highlights from other collections in addition to the traditional solo show. It was during this time that Knud V. Jensen's so-called sauna principle was implemented. That is, mixing warm and cold shows, so that a warm exhibition of, say, Picasso would secure lots of visitors and income, and at the same time that Louisiana could show a cold or more untraditional exhibition that the public might not know of before. A brief overview of the program of exhibitions reveals some exceptionally innovative shows. There was Movement in Art from 1961, presented at Stedelijk, Moderna Museet and Louisiana, Moderna Museet in Stockholm. And this show was characteristic for the collaboration with the two director-curator pioneers, Willem Sandberg in Stedelijk and the Pontus Hultén, who was the director at Moderna Museet back then. Movement in Art focused on movement as a strong force in 20th century art and created a highly impactful live event presenting actions and live performances curated in close collaboration with contemporary artists. And I'm sorry I don't have photos to show of this. I had serious computer problems, so we'll have to just look at this while I'm speaking. But for Movement in Art, and in Denmark especially, Jean Tinguely's exploding machines made headlines partially because a white pea stove died in the action. In 1997, Tabernacle also became a veritable succès de scandale. Here, contemporary politically and socially experimental artists like Josef Beuys from Germany and some of his students, experimental Danish art schools, ex-Skolen artists like Per Kirkeby and Paul Gernes, intervened into the museum, while Bjørn Nørgaard held a performance inviting the press to document a ritual slaughtering of a horse to protest the war in Vietnam, and Per Kirkeby slept in a tent inside the museum. They all crossed the borders between art and life, and even of the open-minded environment of Louisiana. Some artists eventually left the exhibition in protest. Even though Knud V. Jensen founded Louisiana as a private museum, he was very active in the Danish cultural politics and public life. He believed strongly in the public role of art. Coming from a wealthy background, he was a successful businessman who actually sold his family firm in order to establish Louisiana and a related foundation to secure the future of the museum, which nonetheless, in Danish social democratic tradition, also receives state support. One of the most important contributions Jensen made was his clear voice in the process of establishing a Ministry of Culture in Denmark in 1961. He took part in debates, published articles and books, and created a foundation that owned both Louisiana and the publishing house Gyldendal. I was just told I was speaking too quickly, so I'll slow down a bit. In 1966, okay, yeah. Jensen published the book Wonderland or Utopia, Articles on the Cultural Politics of the Welfare State. In Danish you can see Slaraffenland eller Utopia. And here Wonderland alludes to the growing wealth and materialism of the 1960s, which Jensen found problematic, writing, and I quote, "The ideal of the present society of abundance is the old myth of Wonderland in a modern version with grilled chickens and flirtatious cover girls in a well-organized holiday paradise. The will of consumers seems the law." End of quote. He contrasted this with utopia on the other side, which he viewed as fundamental to European thinking, an evolution of culture and civilization. However, Jensen wrote, the utopias of thinkers, scientists, and artists was in danger of drowning, flooded by the growing materialism and the new leisure-focused society. The welfare society, he argued, needs strong cultural politics in order to balance the material and spiritual needs in order to secure a responsible democratic society. Today, the world that saw the birth of Louisiana has changed immeasurably. Vast technological, economic, cultural, and political changes present a range of new challenges to democratic welfare societies, as well as to museum exhibitions and the curators who create them, profoundly impacting the art, its display, and its relationship to the public. This change in museum exhibitions I'm referring to is often characterized as what former Tate director Nicola Sirota describes as a preference for experience over interpretation. In its first decades, Louisiana, as I have argued, formed a very vital balancing of this experience and interpretation. When opening Louisiana's new spaces, including a concert hall, for example, you see here, he claimed, and I quote, "The more possibilities for experiences our program presents, the more Louisiana fulfills its purpose to be a musical and creative meeting place and an environment deeply engaged in the contemporary society." End of quote. At the same time, Jensen stressed in a letter to the museum board that the goal for Louisiana was in no way to become some sort of exhibition machine for entertaining purposes only. This was in 1976, but in the following decades, Louisiana's exhibition strategy certainly came very close to that which it claimed to protest, an exhibition machine. Even though Louisiana is loved by the general public, it has been criticized by art professionals for its lack of ambition and curatorial audacity, with some critics judging it as too conservative and conformist, including myself when I was writing as an art critic for the Danish daily Politiken in the early 1990s. Conservative because of its long line of retrospective solo shows of famous, usually male, modern artists conforming to the myth of the genius artists. Louisiana, for example, has presented more than 5 Picasso solo shows. Indeed, the warm exhibitions seem to have taken over. What used to be disruptive, innovative, and flexible structures at Louisiana have hardened into a more settled art institution, as is the case for most of its fellow forerunners in the museum world of the late 50s, 60s, and 70s. And this is the paradox of the contemporary and modern art museum. When the present is preserved, contemporary art becomes art history. Also, the present cult of contemporary and modern art and the capitalist skyrocketing of the art market presents even more challenges for an art museum insisting on art as an essential component of free, creative, and democratic spaces. At the same time, the Louisiana model's emphasis on the contemporary is no longer the exception, it is rather the norm. I'm almost there. One common way of curating the contemporary is to work closely with contemporary artists, making the museum not only a collector and exhibitor, but also a producer of art. This goes for many museums of contemporary and modern art, but also increasingly for traditional museums. And here I will return to the Danish National Gallery in Copenhagen again as example. The old institution is transforming in order to be relevant for a contemporary public. Temporary exhibitions are commonplace now, and they are combined with para-curatorial, cultural, and social events. Thus, the majestic, stately, and solemn institution and its spaces are being transformed in order to accommodate and welcome a broader, non-elitist, and younger audience. So as you can see here, the vestibule thus no longer greets the visitor with an imposing staircase leading to mainly didactic displays of art history. Today, the visitor's gaze is guided to raise curiosity rather than respectful awe. Now, for instance, the very first art object the visitor meets in the lobby is a work by the contemporary Danish-Vietnamese artist Jan Vo. Those of you who were any of you at the opening yesterday where Jan Vo was speaking and talking about this piece actually? Okay, so I'll just tell you a bit about it. So his work is the chandelier. You can also see it in the program at page 12. And it's highly decorative, and it's titled 0803 2805 2009, and is characteristic of Vo's artistic strategy. He uses found objects to play with implicit cultural meaning in both simple and very complex ways that allude to both personal and political perspectives. The chandelier here is from the late 18th century. More importantly, though, it was one of three placed over the conference table in the Paris Hôtel Majestic, where the Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1973. The Paris Peace Accords formally ended the Vietnam War. However, when the US troops withdraw, Saigon fell to North Vietnam, and these events forged huge numbers of millions of South Vietnamese to flee by boat, including Jan Vo and his family. And they were rescued by a Danish boat, so they ended up in Denmark. Thus, the decorative chandelier bears witness to the artist's personal story as part of a larger political development, all while still dazzling and delighting viewers with its elegant beauty. When Vo had a large solo show at SMK last year, the same show that was more or less the same show that was shown in Guggenheim in New York, he also rearranged sections of the museum space displaying objects from the museum's permanent collection in new and unexpected ways. He even functioned as interior designer of the new museum cafeteria. What was shockingly provoking some 50 years ago in a Danish museum setting, a cafeteria, is standard, yeah, absolutely fundamental today. In its more standardized art museum format, Louisiana continues to try and interact with important issues in the contemporary society in different ways. Here I will point at one important curatorial turn. Here you can see the entrance to Louisiana again. It's really not a monumental museum. It's hard to even photo the entrance. But what I'll point at here is the show, because Louisiana seems to have embarked on a particular art historical strategy on rewriting the history of modern art with particular focus on women artists, like luckily other museums today also. The past decade, Louisiana has used a very traditional exhibition format of the solo show to curate women artists into the canon. Early modernists like Hilma Klint and Paula Modersohn-Becker, as you see here, or contemporary artists such as Yayoi Kusama and Marina Abramovic. Right now, the Swiss artist Pippi Lottie-Rist has a large retrospective solo show, Open My Glade, at Louisiana. The exhibition is a result of a close curatorial collaboration between museum curator and artist. The number of solo shows by women artists at Louisiana is growing, and in this way exhibitions are being used to rewrite history. But while aspiring to curate the contemporary, Louisiana, like the majority of major museums of modern art, continues to seemingly prefer to collect male artists. So let me end here. On this almost final slide I show you, you see the first sculpture by a woman artist placed in the Louisiana Sculpture Park. Polish Alicia Quadras past Pro Toto, the marble planet stone you see, was acquired last year. And here you see Quadras, sorry I don't know the pronunciation right, Quadras marble planets are temporarily flanked by Pippi Lottie-Rist's string of enlightened briefs, or enlightened hips as it is called, from 2011. And this definitely attracts young and Instagramming visitors. Maybe they will even discuss the paradox of the contemporary museum. Thank you.
Så, kommer min efter?
Yeah. Okay, maybe.
Thank you, Marlene. We're going to change seats. We're not changing names, though, so let me see. And I'm going to sit. So, because I have to take off my glasses. This is the last slide of Marlene, and that's just show a book that I have been writing for, that Marlene just published. So that shows the good collaboration between Norway and Denmark, Marlene. And I am the director of the Henie Onstad Art Center, as it said here. We usually use the Norwegian term Kunstsenter. It opened 10 years after Louisiana Museum that Marlene was talking about. And a lot of things happened in 10 years, but quite a few things have become a norm after 10 years. And Henie Onstad, when it opened, was formed on the basis of Louisiana Museum, the Moderna Museet, and the Stedelijk, as was already mentioned. Very important role models for this museum, and as you can see here, as it is for the Louisiana Museum that you saw previously, it's hard to find the entrance. There's no solid stairs or columns that tells you that you're now entering a building, and you're now entering maybe an intertwined space between the inside and the outside. The Henie Onstad Kunstcenter facade is mainly glass facade, and is supposed to kind of mirror the inside to the outside, so that there shouldn't really be a limit between what goes outside or inside. Equally to the Louisiana Museum, it's surrounded by a nice park. I wouldn't say a beautiful park, because Louisiana has a fantastic park, but we have a nice park. And we do have a few more female sculptures in it too, so that's good. But it was so informed by the programs, by the three previously mentioned institutions, that they decided to build it as an art center. And you might ask, what is the difference between an art center and a museum, and except for that a museum collects, preserves, and presents? They were so much discussing this term museum, even though they did have a collection, they had planned to collect. 3 months before the opening, they changed the name from Henie Onstad Museum to Henie Onstad Kunstcenter, because they felt in '68 that Kunstcenter, an art center, sounded far more contemporary and modern than being an old, boring museum. Today, I would claim that the opposite has happened. I think so much is going on in the museum, and the museum is a fantastic tool for looking at the past, in the contemporary, pointing to the future. And we can do so because we do have collections, we have a history, and our role in understanding history has become even more important now than before. So I would say as a director that I work at the Henie Onstad Museum, but the correct title is the Kunstcenter. They were so modern at that time that they thought that they would create a museum that could be used for anything. So they built a big space for performance, theater, and ballet, and the modern ballet started actually at the museum. Now we have specialized scenes for opera, ballet, jazz musicians, even modern dance has its own house. But at that time, this was a melting pot of different kinds of attitudes, styles, and ideas. Quite radical too. Now the 68 is very different from 58. The 68 is formed by very many dramatic happenings that also formed the Henie Onstad, and it was seen as something of a bourgeoisie place, even though it had a very radical program. So the building itself, made of concrete and glass and teak interiors, was a very big contrast to a radical program. And this was really on the countryside in 68. So with this heritage of mixing styles and periods and the possibility of thinking non-linear time, it has always been a possibility for me as director and curator to think of exhibitions that combined historical works with contemporary, and to let them challenge each other, and to work in exhibitions that are formed depending on subjects rather than an ism or an art historical topic, which is kind of challenging but also a lot of fun. Another thing about working at a museum that is acting like a Kunsthalle is that we can work closely with the artist, as so has the Louisiana Museum, as you've heard, and to develop projects together with artists. So I'm going to present to you a project now, and I'm going to take you through quite a few slides, and sorry for the interpreter that I'm not following my manuscript, but you will hang on and knock on the cubicle if it goes too fast. We have an artist research program in Norway where artists can actually do research, and they do also get a PhD by now. It's debated if it's really science. And this discussion between science and art, I think, is very interesting and fruitful. So in 2010 until 2013, I invited Norwegian artist Arne Hjort Gutte to do a research with me. And She was a research fellow at the Academy dealing with the question of education and what education means today and what it has meant historically, and not at least, how does it look? So we started on a project called Learning for Life. And are there any Swedes here? No. Karin Mannheimer, very important Swedish filmmaker, made a series for TV called Learning for Life, where she was looking at the youth life at school. And that program gave the title for the project. From that project, we developed another book, A Reader with a Danish art historian, Lars Bang-Larsen. So we're very Scandinavian in this project. But education has a very specific Scandinavian touch to it in Scandinavia too, I think. So that ended up with the reader, Phantom of Liberty, Contemporary Art and the Educational Paradox. So here we are entering into another paradox, Marlene. Mm-hmm. The question we posed in Learning from Life is, how can you learn to be free in an institution where the pedagogical method implies subordination? This is a classical discussion we took from Immanuel Kant that he formulated in his essay on education in 1803. But the pedagogical paradox describes a relation caught between autonomy and the exercise of authority, a problem that arises perpetually in pedagogical contexts, in school as well as in other contexts in society where power is being used, such as in curating, as we agree upon that also curating a show is a use of power. Or you can find it in management theory. You want your workers to work freely, but within certain frames. Or even the daily running of a museum by the end of the day. So, this is a still from a film called Freedom Requires That Someone is Free. And it's a film still from Arne Hjort Gutte's film about freedom. And if you look at this photo, it's from a suburb in Norway. You see a lot of parents. And what are they looking at? Well, they are outside of school, so it's obviously the first day at school. And the children are lined up to say goodbye to their parents before they go to their first day at school. But this peculiar child took their parents' camera and took a photo of the parents instead. He took control of the view. So Arne Hjort Gutte did a whole film interviewing this child about his understanding of freedom and what he thought about school. And in this still, he says, it is like hell. This beautiful little kid says once in this film that the only place he feels free is when he has the key to the home and he goes on his own to his home and he turns on the light. That's his idea of freedom. So freedom requires that someone is free, and how do we discipline someone to become free? Well, that is the classical paradox. It's also a paradox for the museum, of course. So this should be familiar to many of you. This is a painting called The History by Edvard Munch. It was painted in 2012 and is part of the auditorium decoration at the university in Oslo. Have you seen it? Some of you have. Well, Norway was a very young country at that time. And finally, we had our own university. Well, I mean, the Danes ruled Norway and the Swedes. So we had a bit of a thing to work on to build our own country. And Edvard Munch was commissioned to paint the gigantic paintings for this auditorium. And what did he choose? No sciences represented. Instead, he painted a fisherman under a tree. And he's not only a fisherman, he's an old fisherman, and he's blind. And he's teaching his child by using his hands. And I think Munch was very smart here, because he tells us that the experience through your hands and your body is a very important way of experiencing the world. He was heavily criticized for this, because where are the big sciences? Where's the books? Where's the costumes? Where are the sciences? Well, Munch answered to Christian Krogt, whom some of you might know, was very important for developing the art education in Norway. He himself a painter. He criticized this for the lack of the sciences. Well, Munch answered, the sagas of Norway's history were passed down by words of mouth. Legend is preserved in the language of the people. There is, therefore, nothing to stop a fisherman or a working man from telling a boy the story of his country. At the same time, in the 1900s, Norway participated in the exposition in Paris, the exhibition in Paris. And what did Norway send? We send tests to present how well Norwegian school children could write. And this presentation actually also won a prize during the affair in the 1900s. And this says, Marstrand, 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 until this really young person could know his letter by hand directly. And the next sentence says, without a fight, no coin can be turned. Repeated so many times that this child certainly knew what he was doing. And of course, this is technology in 1900. This is what was needed for a bureaucrat to become good. And by showing this, Norway was also showing the standard and the quality of the children and the future nature to come. So, working in a contemporary museum means that you can actually combine all of these things in the museum if you do the research. So here you see how it was displayed in the exhibition, book by book, beautifully presented and very touching. From the same museum we borrowed something else, and I find this quite interesting because you see there are textile works. And of course, these are not, fine art of high quality. These are children's test works. But you see, the red line defines dramatically 1975, where we get a new school law. And since I'm talking outside of my I have to come back to my text here. So, these are embroideries and girls' tests of their schoolwork. And this is where, on the left side, you will see, to your right side, you will see what they were doing until 1975, where you would say that the aim of the instruction in needlework is to foster the children's interest and to develop their abilities for practical work by teaching them to keep their clothes in good repair and to make simple garments, and so on. While, you can see them presented in the museum, in 1974, a new law says the teaching should aim to stimulate the pupils' artistry, their aesthetic sensibility, and their means of experiencing the joy of creativity, and so forth. So, this is what happens to handwriting today, isn't it? There is no classical handwriting, at least not in Norway, and handwriting is still voluntarily now, because most children learn this movement, or this. Mm-hmm. So we're changing our bodies also through how we act with these kind of technologies. So in this project, we invited artists to do new projects as well, to put them together and to contrast them with historical objects. So this is a diary by a girl of 13 years old who were working with an artist for a week, taking the artist around in the cities she knew and that Harold Fletcher didn't know. So we presented their diary on the wall. If there's any Swedes here, they would know this painting. A very, very important painting for the discussion of the role of education. And this is how we've been positioning children for so many years. And this painting is called Will You Be Profitable, Little Friend? and it's by Petter Tilberg and painted in 72. So in the 70s we have this break, this start-up discussion also of the disciplinary school and system and how we transform our children. So we presented, of course, this work together with another, because this looks much like the cubicle that the translator has been based in, because it's temporary, because everything is temporary. So Øystein Wyller Odden, a Norwegian artist, built this cubicle, and this cubicle is actually the standard size of a group room, a base school in Norway. So he was testing the physical conditions for teaching today within the museum and letting us and allowing us to go into these kind of spaces that can be transformed into anything. And a base school is a school without classical classroom teaching. It's group work. And some of us might know that from the work life as well. That's how we work. We form groups and we work together, and then we form new groups. So this is a flexible building system developed by the Oslo's educational building agencies, and it says a lot about the ideology of teaching today and how we are also expecting our children to develop. This is how it looked on the inside. You have low ceilings, no air condition, because you're not supposed to be there very long. I hope the translators have some in there. You can't talk about education and freedom without touching upon this project. It's Palle Nielsen, Danish architect and very famous for his outdoor sculptures, who did a very interesting project for the Moderna Museet in 1968, where he built a crazy playground for children, where he stated, there is no exhibition. It is only an exhibition because the children are playing in an art museum. It is only an exhibition for those who are not playing. That's why we call it a model. And this project was called A Model for a Qualitative Society. Perhaps it will be the model for the society children want. Perhaps children can tell us so much about their own world that this can also be a model for us. We hope so. Therefore, we are letting the children present their model to those who are working with or are responsible for the environment provided for children outside in the adult world, aka the museum. So what happened when they let the children play in these crazy playgrounds? You couldn't do that today. You will have safety and healthy regulations following you every step, and it would have been closed down very quickly, as was this by the fire department in Stockholm, but it opened again. But what happened was that they had surveillance cameras, so scientists could follow the children's free playground. So they became, rats in an experiment. So that's kind of the challenge of this free play that they created. And the children were playing within very highly ideological framework, for instance, against Mao, with masks of famous politicians at that time. So it was a highly politicized project with children in it. But still, I think a lot was tested within what a museum can be today with this project. And this freedom, this possibility of just taking a hammer and build something, or climb a tree and fall down and learn from that, is somehow disappearing in our world today. Oh, I'm going to skip this. We had a lot of films also in the exhibition. But I want to jump to... how much time do I have?
Not so much.
Oh, I don't have much time. Okay, so we're ending... Okay. So I'm just going to show the Portuguese artist Priscila Fernandes, who did an installation called For a Better World. And have any of you heard of Kidzania? Some of you have. I don't have children. I've never been there, but I've heard it's horrible. It's actually a place. It's part of an international corporate chain of play areas for children in large shopping malls, where the kids can play working environments where they can assume different kinds of roles as adults. And the fatigue that this child is presenting playing a shop lady is quite interesting, I think. So is the poor guy working at McDonald's or trying to pretend to work there. And Priscilla Fernandez, you can see that at the end, it's a double project because she also filmed a playground from the 68s, which is pretty much what Paula Nilsson would have done, set up a set of possibilities and see what happens, instead of highly regulating into the game of what the children should learn. So she doubled this perspective of highly controlled and commercialized play with a playground from the 68 where grown-ups were actually playing. So what do you learn from doing a project like this in a museum? Once you open up for this kind of discussion, well, you have to try consequence of what you find, but you also have to test and research within an exhibition as this leads you also to the possibility of changing hierarchies. And in very many museums, where are the children's workshop? They're in the basement, where the worst light is. So we tested. We thought, let's bring the children up into the light and let us make some exhibitions in the children's space. And here you can see it's very heavily fenced in, even where the children are. So we moved the children up into the exhibition space, which was quite a lot of fun. They were allowed to paint on a wall. Hardly anywhere else they're allowed to do that. And you can see how high the children were, or the parents lifted them up so they can paint higher. And this wall became this kind of a massive chaos of children's drawing, and we had to repaint it many, many times. And it was a lot of fun to see how they developed during the days. But Henie Onstad Kunstcenter isn't, within an idea of the educational program, only a place for exhibitions. We're an evening school. We have a lot of programs for children during the day and the night. And the children take place in courses and classes where this space were also used. And what happens then? Well, the same thing as with Paula Nilsson's project. The children playing are on display. And actually the children came to us and said, we prefer to be back in our own room. Because we want to be in peace when we develop our project. So we've sent them back with a little bit of a better light. But anyway, we made an exhibition. This is the Philosopher's Stone, a big heavy stone on an old table in that space. And of course, here's the kids back in their space where they can make a mess as much as they want. This might be your future director. This might be a future leader of an oil company, who knows? I think what the museum can do today is something that the school is no longer doing, is to create this kind of space for free thinking, or at least the possibility of thinking freely and develop something that doesn't lead up to any kind of grade or test system, so that you can actually see if you can find yourself, because finding yourself is important. And this girl who's just finished her high school, who's now photographing herself in a Kusama installation, maybe she learned something about being in a space in 3 dimensions instead of being in 1 dimension. Because this is what happens when you bring technology into the museum. None of the kids were looking at the artworks. They're all on the screen. So finding a way to develop a project that combines the possibility of interacting, taking pictures, be part of it, feel that you're part of something, and not ending up being swallowed into a small screen, and finding a way to combine those 2 things, I think, is the challenge for the museum in the future. Thank you. So, any questions? I mean, what I think is interesting here is that we've been talking about that we take for granted is that the exhibition is no longer Bildung in itself. I mean, if you go back to the National Gallery and the history of collections, you would say that making an exhibition in itself is education. It has an educational purpose. While today we have separated that department long from the exhibition itself, And it's developing its own program in parallel to what the exhibition might do or be. Marlene, what do you say?
I would actually be curious if now we didn't talk so much before, but I think the two papers of ours really complemented each other a lot, and I wonder if this way of thinking the museum is particular to our countries, Nordic countries, or is there similar museums and projects around here? Does anybody know? Because one of if you look back, one of the key examples of forming a new museum like this would be Le Centre Pompidou from 1977. But again, today, are there a lot of children's interaction and experimenting with free play or... A gallery?
Yes. Can I have a word?
Sure.
Yes.
Thank you. So there is in the Pompidou Museum, there is a sort of a gallery for teenagers, I think from 10 to 19 years old, and they can interact with, they can create their own artwork and actually study some other artworks. They have a team. For example, the last time when I went, it was listening and the voices, pronunciation, everything with the sound, and they were doing activities about it. So, yeah.
I think new technology is going to change a lot. I mean, anyone here playing video games? Do you know what a video game is? Well, do you know what e-sport is? My God, the world is changing. I mean, concerts are taking place in the video game. People are arranging big things within a virtual space, and they're reaching an audience far larger than you can do in a physical space. And how can we meet with that kind of aesthetics that is created in these spaces? How can we bring that kind of activity into the museum? That's, I think, a big challenge.
I'm thinking the Pippi Lottie-Rest show right now at Louisiana, it's quite interesting to see that, I don't know if you know her work, but she is working very much with the video and moving pictures, but also total installations where the visitor are engulfed. Like you won't see, for example, a picture of a living room, but you will become some sort of actor yourself in a living room, in a large darkened room, and you walk around in these installations, or you lie on a couch and you look up to the ceilings and see this dreamy, like sort of. She started out as doing films for music, like music films, and has developed this. All this to say that it was really interesting for me to see that it was all types of visitors coming to the show. Children loved it, teenagers, women and men also. And I think because it had all this new technology, but it was not, it was used in a different way than you have available in other spaces outside the museum. At the same time, I do believe that the museum is one of the things the museum can do now, facing all this digital technologies, is to show something else, like show and present spaces where you can be together in different ways.
I agree. That's why Munch is still so relevant, isn't it? Thank you.
Thank you.